Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 7 of this discussion/lecture series on Robert Pirsig Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Whether you're listening to this now or at some point in the future, I hope that you find it enjoyable and educational and, in the true spirit of Pirsig, a high-quality experience. If you do happen to be listening to this shortly after posting or even live, I feel the need to apologize/explain for the dearth of project videos recently on the channel. I actually broke my camera, and it's in the shop and has been in the shop for a couple of weeks. And that's quite frustrating because there's actually quite a few projects that I have going. I should be getting the camera this weekend, hopefully, and so hopefully lots of projects will resume soon. So I feel the need to, if not apologize for that because it's somewhat outside of my control, at least explain it. I know lots of you are here for the project videos, and well, that's absolutely fine. So today, we're going to talk about Robert Pirsig, well, really Phaedrus, right? This is Robert Pirsig's old personality. We're going to talk about Phaedrus's experiences at the college in Bozeman, Montana, teaching rhetoric. And we're going to talk about his first discovery/investigation/inquiry into what quality is. And welcome everyone who does happen to be watching live. I think that we're also going to be able to pick up speed just a little bit. I think we've been moving fairly slowly through the book up until this point. I think we get to pick up speed quite a bit. Up until this point, in my view, what Robert Pirsig has been doing is he's been laying the foundation for the real core thesis, the real core idea of his book, for the real payoff, and that payoff is coming over the next few chapters. And so all this talk about classicism and romanticism and the scientific method and motorcycles and a priori ideas and a posteriori ideas, all of that has been, in many ways, I think, set up. It's all been set up for the payoff that he's about to deliver in the next few chapters. So this is the part of the book that I'm actually most excited about, and not only for the ideas, but also for a few personal connections. So this begins when Phaedrus is teaching at the university. We're starting in, I think, about chapter 15 and going through 19. So Phaedrus is teaching rhetoric at a university. He's teaching writing, and this is interesting to me for a few different reasons. One is that I actually happen to have been a teacher of rhetoric at a large research university for 2 years while I was earning my master's of English degree, and my emphasis was in rhetoric. I actually taught freshman composition classes just like Robert Pirsig did, just like Phaedrus did. And so to hear his experience and to compare these experiences, my experience versus his experience, is quite interesting. And to see how all the ideas he had flowed out of that, that's quite interesting to me. Another very compelling connection for me is that in this section of the book, Phaedrus talks quite a bit about education. He talks quite a bit about education. And when I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, I was actually in high school. I was, I believe I was either a junior or a senior in high school. I don't precisely remember which when I first read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And the connection here is actually quite interesting. And this was the same high school that other Joseph went to, actually. And it's a small charter school in South Jordan, Utah called Paradigm High School. And if you don't know what a charter school is, it receives public funds. It receives funding from the state, but then it also it also has quite a bit more freedom and autonomy to explore different educational options. So, for example, I have a brother who went to another charter high school here in Utah that was paired with a community college. And so people were able to graduate from high school with an associate's degree, which, is a really cool thing. That's a phenomenal thing. And if that's the kind of option that's available to you, then you should definitely take it. I had two brothers who went to that school and both had a very, very good experience. So I was going to this small charter high school, and what this is interesting not only because of the way this charter high school was, but also because of my educational background. This was the second charter school I had been to. I had also previously gone to public schools. I had also previously homeschooled. And so I was thinking about education a lot. I had been exposed to a number of different educational experiences, and I wanted to get a good education, whatever it is that that good education is. Whatever it is, I wanted it. And so I spent quite a bit of time thinking about it, and going to this charter school that was also brand new. It had just started. The year that I started going to it was the year that it started. And so I had lots of opportunities to think about education. And this was a school that also really prompted you to think about education. To give you a sense of kind of what the flavor was like, let me describe one of the core classes. So one of the core classes I took was called a scholar class, and basically what it was a 2-period class where we would read literature, read philosophy, read history, and then discuss it and write about it. So it was very free form. There were only about, I think, probably 10, 12 students in the class maybe. And there was just a lot of really good discussion, a lot of really good inquiry. It was not at all like a traditional college classroom. Actually, it was very close to, if any of you have ever gone to grad school in the humanities, you have seminar courses where there's just, somewhere between 5 and 10 of you around a table and you're discussing ideas with the professor. It was very much like that. It was like a grad school seminar, and I was getting that in high school, which was a really amazing experience. So that's a few of the things that I think about as I approach Phaedrus's experience at the university, his experience teaching rhetoric. So let's talk about that a little bit. And so what's happening in the narrative? Let's root ourselves in the narrative. What's happening is that Piersig, in the present, right, riding across the Dakotas on a motorcycle, he's now in Montana with his son Chris. They've stopped at the house of, I believe it's Robert DeWeese. And Robert DeWeese is one of the former faculty members at that college, one of Phaedrus's colleagues when he taught there at the university. And so they're just staying there for a couple of days. And John and Sylvia go home. And at some point, Phaedrus, or Piersig, I guess I should say, Piersig decides to go back and visit the university that he used to teach at. And remember, he doesn't remember very much of what happened to that university. He only remembers a few fragments because, of course, he was electrocuted. He had electroshock therapy applied to him, and his old personality was destroyed. Okay, so he goes and visits, and he has this wave of memories that come back. And one of the important memories that he has is of a student. Okay, so he's teaching rhetoric, he's teaching writing. And one of the things that Piersig, the author, calls teaching rhetoric is he calls it a huge Sargasso Sea of stagnated logic. And I think what he means by that is that, teaching writing and learning writing is very different from being in a math class, for example. In a math class, the right and wrong answers, for the most part, unless you're doing if I understand correctly, unless you're doing, very advanced theoretical math, the right answers and the wrong answers are just very clear. They're very plain, and if you've got the right answer, you've got the right answer. And if you've got the wrong answer, you've got the wrong answer. And it's very easy to tell whether you're doing it right or not. Now in writing, and it's very easy to explain where people have gone wrong in their steps, right? There are defined procedures for solving these mathematical problems, and mastery in most math classes basically consists in your ability to master that defined set of procedures and apply them to a pre-selected array of problems that are put in front of you on a test or on an assignment. So it's very, at least relatively speaking, it's very, very cut and dry. Now, writing is not like that at all. Teaching writing and learning writing at a university level, or perhaps at a high school level too, it's totally different. Not least because there's this whole branch of writing called creative writing that is just, again, a huge Sargasso Sea of stagnated logic. Like, there is such thing as good creative writing and there is such thing as bad creative writing, but it's really hard to define what it is, and it's really hard to teach students what it is because it's the sort of creative enterprise. In the classical and romantic dialectic, or in the classical romantic system that Piersig has given us up until now, mathematics or the hard sciences, they're very classical, right? They're very well defined. They're very well structured. Whereas, something like creative writing is ever so much more romantic. It's ever so much more creative. It's ever so much less mapped, less defined, less easy to structure out and teach in some kind of, rigorous, structured way. And this is not only true for creative writing, this is also true for nonfiction writing. If you're writing like persuasive essays or so forth, you have a whole array of potential arguments, and you have a whole array of, potential metaphors and figures. You have a whole array of evidences that you can bring to bear, a whole array of ways that you can structure those arguments. And so, even writing nonfiction, even writing argumentative nonfiction, even writing a philosophy paper is, to varying degrees, still a pretty creative activity. And to that degree that it's creative, it's not well defined. And to that degree that it's not well defined, it's hard to teach. So, in a math class or a science class, you can just do these multiple choice questions, and put them in on a Scantron, and you can grade these things just incredibly quickly. But for writing, the fastest I could ever get through any of my students' papers was about 15 minutes, right? And so you start multiplying that out. If you teach a class of 20 students, that's 5 hours to grade every paper. And by the way, this is one of the dirty little secrets of college classes, is that if there's a large writing component and there isn't a TA to grade those papers, it's very difficult for the professor to give any kind of substantial, interesting, helpful feedback on those papers. Just because giving substantial, interesting, helpful feedback on a 5-page paper or a 10-page paper is so incredibly time consuming. And the more substantive you want that feedback to be, the more time consuming it is. And not only is it time consuming, but it's also often difficult to tell exactly what is right and wrong about the paper, because again, there are multiple different good ways to write any particular paper. I mean, that's what the whole discipline of writing is predicated on, right? And in fact, in the hard sciences, if you were going to do a Scantron type test, then doing well on that test is defined by getting the same exact answer as everybody else. If you're varying your answers, right? If everybody puts down an A because that's the right answer and you put down a B, that creativity is not rewarded. That's just called a wrong answer, right? But in writing, if 2 people hand in the same paper, we call that plagiarism. And we will fail one of you and maybe kick you out of the university. And presumably that is what we should do. It certainly seems to make quite a bit of sense, but I just want to point out that difference, right? And so you actually, in teaching writing and teaching rhetoric, you appreciate the variation, you appreciate the differences, you want that. And even if 2 papers make the same or a similar argument, you want them to be different, right? You want them to make that argument in a new, creative, and interesting way. And that's absolutely fine, but it makes it very, very, very hard to teach. Let me see, I believe that there's quite a good quote about this, if I can find it. Yeah, what he says is, to a methodical, laboratory-trained mind, rhetoric is just completely hopeless. It's like a huge Sargasso Sea of stagnated logic. He says, the crushing teaching load is bad enough, but what for him was far worse was that he understood. And remember, Phaedrus has been classically trained, right? Entered a university at age 16 to study biochemistry. He is, in terms of science, in terms of these hard methods of inquiry that humans have, he's very good. And he says, what for him was far worse was that he understood in his precise analytic way that the subject he was teaching, rhetoric, was undoubtedly the most unprecise, analytic, amorphous area in the entire Church of Reason, in the entire university system. And so what he describes is that he says, let's see. He says, every rule he honestly tried to discover, every rule that he tries to teach them of what good writing constitutes, it's so full of exceptions and contradictions and qualifications and confusions that he wishes he'd never come across the rule in the first place. And actually, I had a specific experience teaching, when I was teaching writing at a university, and I asked my students, well, okay, so is it better to write something short or long? Is it better to write something in kind of, an everyday casual vocabulary, or in a very elevated, elegant, and refined vocabulary? Is it better to write something creative or something factual? Is it better to write something with lots of footnotes and citations, or something that you come up with on your own? There's so many, and it's hard to lay down any kind of rule for that, because the answer is always, it depends, right? Are you writing a letter to a friend? Well, if you cite footnotes in a letter to a friend, they're probably going to think that's weird. Conversely, if you write an academic paper for your professor and you're using, this very casual personal style, your professor will probably fail you, and they probably should fail you. So it's hard to find sort of these universal, generalizable rules in writing that are so easy to find in mathematics, seemingly, and so easy to find in the hard sciences, seemingly. He describes a particular instance that I find is very, very interesting and revelatory. We are going to work our way back to quality eventually, but I want to sit in these educational experiences for a while, because it's out of these educational experiences that Phaedrus gets the seed of quality to sprout. It's how he starts inquiring into these things, right? So he has a student, and the way he describes this student, let's see. There we go. He says he'd been having trouble with students who had nothing to say. And at first he thinks it's laziness, but then it becomes apparent that it's not that way. He has one specific student who he describes as a girl with strong lens glasses who wants to write a 500-word essay on the United States. And he gets this kind of sinking feeling. in his stomach because he doesn't think, it's just going to be, it's going to be a low quality essay. It's not going to be a very good essay. She's just going to, it's going to be like reading a Wikipedia summary, right? And so this idea comes to him and he says, well, how about instead you write a 500-word essay on Bozeman, Montana, right? Let's not write about the whole United States. Let's write about something much smaller. Let's write about Bozeman, Montana. And so it turns out that the paper comes due and she has nothing. She can't think of anything to say. And he knows about her that the way he describes her is that she's very serious, disciplined, and hardworking, but very dull, without a spark of creativity in her. He describes her eyes behind the thick lensed glasses as the eyes of a drudge. She's not bluffing. She really can't think of anything to say, and she was upset by her inability to fulfill the assignment, right? And so he's stumped too. He doesn't know what to tell her, and the idea that he comes up with is, okay, so let's try narrowing it down even further. Like, don't write about Bozeman, Montana. Instead, let's just write a 500-word essay about the main street of Bozeman, Montana. And she actually comes back in tears because she does not know what to say. She can't write a 500-word essay on the main street of Bozeman, Montana. She does not know what to say. And this actually kind of strikes an interesting chord for Phaedrus because remember Phaedrus's experience back at the university where he was kicked out of the university for having too much to say, for seeing too many hypotheses, right? And this is what he says: for every fact, there's an infinity of hypotheses. The more you look, the more you see. So somehow she's looking, but she's not looking, right? She's looking, but she's not seeing. To use the phrase from the first chapter of the book, the truth is knocking on her door and she's not seeing it. So why isn't she seeing it? And so what he says is he told her angrily, narrow it down to the front of one building on the main street of Bozeman, the Opera House. Start with the upper left-hand brick. So he tells her to go write a 500-word essay on the upper left-hand brick of the Opera House on the main street of Bozeman, Montana. You could barely write about a smaller thing. Anyway, she does that. She goes away and she comes back and she's got, I believe she says, a 5,000-word essay. So it's 10 times as long as it was supposed to be. A 5,000-word essay on the front of the Opera House on the main street of Bozeman, Montana. And what she says is, I sat in the hamburger stand across the street and started writing about the first